Hey everyone, welcome to lesson 5.10.1. This is Reconstruction Part 1. And by the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the effects of government policy during Reconstruction on society from 1865 to 1877. So let's take a look at Reconstruction. That's the name we give the period of history immediately following the Civil War when the federal government moves in to reconstruct or rebuild the South following their defeat in the Civil War. And Reconstruction actually starts before the war ends under President Lincoln, and then it continues under Andrew Johnson after Lincoln is assassinated. And both Lincoln and Johnson are pushing for a quick end to the war and a quick restoration of the South. If you remember in his first inaugural, Lincoln said, with malice towards none and charity towards all. That was his goal for bringing the country back together as quickly and as peaceably as possible. However, in Congress, a group of radical Republicans, many of whom were former abolitionists, have a different agenda. And radical Republicans want to see the South punished for the Civil War. They want to see those people responsible, from the leaders down to the soldiers, to pay a price. And they want to guarantee equality for the African American people in the South. They feel that it's very important that Black people get their individual rights and equal protection of those rights in the newly free America. So let's start first with presidential Reconstruction under Lincoln and Johnson. Lincoln initially just allows the southern states to run their Reconstruction programs and rebuild themselves. And they start to elect new governments and write constitutions and do the things that they have to do to go back to being full states. Under state-run Reconstruction, there's very little federal intervention in the South. They're deferring to the state governments. That's very important. But when the South holds elections for federal office and statewide office, we see that they're electing a lot of former Confederate leaders to Congress. People that had been in the Confederate Congress now are being sent back to the United States Congress. Confederate governors are getting reelected to Confederate states. The only people that weren't were the very top leaders, like the president of the Confederacy and some of the top generals like Robert E. Lee. They were not allowed to run for election. But generally, we're just restoring the same people that were in power during the Confederacy. The southern states also immediately implement Black codes, and these are laws that establish behavior for the Black people living in the South. And those codes were basically to reconstruct slavery under a different name. Black codes said that Black people in the South could not travel freely. They could not be taught literacy skills. They could not possess firearms. They could not possess alcohol. And in a lot of states, there were Black codes that said if a Black person was either homeless or unemployed, they could be arrested for what's called vagrancy. And then the sheriff would auction them off to planters where they would work off their fine or their punishment and basically put them back as slave labor in the fields again. So these Black codes were just a restoration of the pre-war South. Things under state-run Reconstruction didn't look that different. And honestly, Lincoln didn't do a lot to prevent that, even if he didn't agree with it. There was a limited federal government response in the form of the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a federal government agency. It had some military people that led it and some civilian people. And the Freedmen's Bureau was sent down south to provide assistance to the former enslaved people. A freedman is what they initially called Black people in the South, because remember, they're not citizens. And so the Freedmen's Bureau did some education. They opened up the very first public schools in the South for Black and white students. They also assisted Black people with reading and writing contracts, and they were supposed to help make that transition into full members of an equal society. But the Freedmen's Bureau was also horribly underfunded. It lacked a lot of resources to do that. After Lincoln's assassination, Congressional Reconstruction begins. So Lincoln is killed and Johnson assumes the presidency. But here's the rub about Johnson. When Lincoln picked him as his vice president, he had no intention of Johnson ever assuming the presidency. Johnson was a symbolic candidate to show unity for the country in 1864. Remember, Lincoln was not looking like he was going to win that election. He needed to get Northern votes. So Johnson was a Democrat and a Southerner. He was from Tennessee. He did not support the Confederacy, but he was definitely from the South, and he was definitely a member of the Democratic Party. And so when Lincoln is killed, all of a sudden he becomes president. And the radicals in Congress absolutely will not tolerate Johnson's control. They don't think that he should be president of the United States. And so they just begin to implement their own Reconstruction plan. And this is called Congressional Reconstruction or Radical Reconstruction. And it's very different from state-run Reconstruction and Lincoln's plan. First, the entire governments of the South, First, the entire South is placed under military rule. It's chopped up into 5 districts that cross state lines, and each district is placed under a Union general's command, and that general becomes the person that runs it. And the military institutes martial law in those districts. Southern state governments are abolished, and they're told they have to start over and write new state constitutions and have new elections, but they don't have governments in those states. They have military rule. Voting is prohibited for any white male who supported the Confederacy. So if you were a leader or a soldier, your right to vote was taken away throughout the South. But voting was given to Black Southerners. So in a lot of areas, the only people voting were Southern Black people who were voting. And it's important to note Southern Black voters almost unanimously voted Republican because that was the party of Lincoln and emancipation and radical Reconstruction. But that's going to cause a lot of friction in the South, where white people who had traditionally voted are now told they can't, and they have to watch their former enslaved people going to the polls in their place. Finally, the South will be required to add various constitutional amendments. We'll see in a second, there's an amendment to abolish slavery and deals with Black citizenship and Black voting. And Radical Reconstruction says you cannot come back as a state until you sign off and approve that amendment to the national constitution. The amendments were passed without any Southern votes. There were enough Northern states to ratify them, but the radicals wanted to force the Confederacy to put their name and their stamp of approval on those amendments. So let's take a look at what those amendments were. And this was an important enough issue that Congress felt we don't want to just do it through law. We actually want to change the Constitution, because the South keeps trying to find ways like Black codes to take away the freedoms that Black people should have in the United States. So what we're going to do is we're going to do an amendment, and nothing can overrule an amendment to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment prohibits slavery in the United States. It just says it does not exist anywhere. And that was put in place because Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was only good during the duration of the war. This permanently and forever abolishes slavery in the United States. Shortly after that, the 14th Amendment is passed in response to the Black codes. The 14th Amendment deals with 2 primary issues. One is citizenship, because as you remember, the Dred Scott decision before the Civil War said no Black person in the United States is a citizen, which means they can't vote, they can't sit on juries, and they can't file lawsuits. So it takes a constitutional amendment to override a Supreme Court decision, and that's what the 14th did. And it said that anybody born in the United States, regardless of race, creed, religion, anything, is automatically a citizen. If you're born in this country, you are a U.S. citizen. It further goes on to say that you are a citizen of whichever state you are living in. So Mississippi cannot decide who is or is not a citizen of Mississippi. If they live there, they're a citizen. That takes tremendous power away from the states in deciding who their citizens are. Second, it enacts equal protection of the laws, which means that the laws passed by the states cannot discriminate against a particular group of people based on race, creed, religion. Cannot. Laws have to treat everybody equally in the wording and the intent of the law. So what we're seeing on the 14th Amendment is, again, moving power away from the states. Because if the states violate either of these, the federal government will come in and restrict their power. Same thing we saw down here with radical Reconstruction. The power is shifting from the state to the federal government. Finally, the 15th Amendment says that all people can vote. Now, at the time, it said males. It's referring to men because they were the voters. But it gave black men and later on all black people the right to vote in the United States regardless of race. You can't prohibit someone's voting based on their race. So if you remember, that 15th Amendment is going to be a sticking point with the women's rights movement or first wave feminism, because women organized in 1848 to demand the right to vote, but then they sort of suspended that campaign and focused on abolition because they felt it was a more pressing problem and that we needed to immediately end slavery because that's a moral wrong. And then when slaves get the rights, including the right to vote, when they become citizens, women were under the impression that they would as well. They saw the women's rights and the rights of African Americans were intertwined. However, when the 14th and 15th Amendments were proposed, they mentioned nothing of women. They talked about race. They talked about creed, which is your ethnicity. They talked about religion, but no mention of sex and definitely not gender. So the women's rights movement divided over their support of those. Some women say, yes, we have to support the 14th and 15th because black people need to have those rights constitutionally protected. And once again, there's an immediate danger to them. Women do have some very limited rights, but they don't have any protected if they are a member of a minority group by race. Other women said, no, we work to secure those rights for black people, and they should support us and our demand for our rights as well. And there was a lot of frustration that former abolitionist leaders like Frederick Douglass did not pressure the federal government to put sex in the 14th and 15th Amendment, but they argued that that would be too much and people would not ratify those amendments if they also included sex. So the women's rights movement really splintered into two factions over how these amendments were going to be done. However, by the 1870s and 1880s, unity comes from that disagreement. It lights a fire under the women's rights movement and reignites first wave feminism to get women that right to vote. So they put aside their differences with each other over the amendments, which were already passed, and said, now we have to focus on us. And that movement will continue into the early 20th century. Okay, so we are at the end of part 1 here, and you should be able to explain the effects of government policy during Reconstruction on society. We're primarily talking about African Americans and women when we talk about this, but you might also want to mention what impact it had on white Southerners as well. If you have questions, email or ask your teacher, and as always, have a great day.